I shall rise. I shall come to order.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Hear, hear.
I only have one more of these, so if you'll please humor me. The oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, everybody. We have an excellent debate for you this evening. This House regrets the narrative that we do not negotiate with terrorists. And for this debate, we have some excellent speakers. Dr. Stephen Hewitt for the proposition and Shwesig for the opposition. Before we get to the debate this evening, I would like to invite the clerk to read last week's minutes in the style of Neil Leeson from Taken.
I did a Scottish accent last week, and I don't think I'm going to be able to top that, but I'll give it a shot. I will not look for the minutes. I will not find the minutes, but I will take them as read.
Jamie, it's your last time reading the minutes. Can you please just read them normally?
I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. But I have a very particular set of skills. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you. Skills that, if you don't take these minutes as read, will destroy you.
There seems to be some disagreement in the House. We will have to take a vote by oral acclamation. All those in favour of taking the minutes as read say aye.
Aye.
And all those against say nay.
Nay.
Seems remarkably close. I'll have to consult with my sergeant.
Aye.
The minutes are taken as read.
Resign.
You had your chance. Okay, without any further ado, I would like to invite the proposition speaker to begin the case for proposition bench and the debate this evening. Hear, hear.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for all of the hospitality. Just had a wonderful meal. This is my first time ever in St. Andrews as well. I also had a Liam Neeson reference in my talk, which I now won't use because it's been taken away from me. But I did want to open with an anecdote as a way of introducing my argument, which is obviously I'm speaking in favor of the House motion that laments the fact that we do not negotiate with terrorists. And it's something that happened on March 1st, 1973. And I think I can say without hesitation that I am the only person in the room that was actually alive on March 1st, 1973. I was 26 years old. No, I was 6 years old on that date. So you have to take my word for it. And it involved an event in Khartoum, Sudan, and it involved an event at the Saudi embassy in that city. And they were having an event, a diplomatic gathering, because the US Charge d'Affaires was about to be transferred. And so a number of high-ranking diplomats were at the Saudi embassy in Khartoum, Sudan on March 1st, 1973. And they were there when 8 members of a Palestinian terrorist group called Black September stormed into the building and took all of them hostage, including the US ambassador, including other senior diplomats. The key aspect of what I'm arguing tonight, which I'll get to my 3 main points in a while, connects to with what happened the next day. On the 2nd of March, 1973, President Richard Nixon had a press conference, and during that press conference, he was asked about this ongoing hostage situation in Sudan, and President Nixon said, quote, "We will do everything we can to get them released, but we will not pay blackmail." A few hours after Nixon's words, his pronouncement, and the news traveled to Sudan by radio, the members of Black September took the US ambassador, the US Charge d'Affaires, and a Belgian diplomat to the basement of the Saudi embassy and murdered them, killed them. That approach by Nixon, which obviously was connected to the result of these deaths, became known as the no concessions policy. And the US is not the only country that seeks to avoid negotiating with terrorists, certainly paying ransom. The Palestinians, in the case that I just mentioned, had wanted a number of prisoners released, including Saran, the killer of Robert F. Kennedy Sr. So it's not just the US that has pursued such a policy. United Kingdom has pursued such a policy, as I'm sure you're aware. Israel, just a few months before this event in Khartoum, had a kind of comparable situation at the Munich Olympics when 13 Israeli athletes were taken hostage. The Israeli government refused to allow the West Germans to negotiate, and certainly Israel wasn't ready to negotiate either. And those athletes ended up being killed, first two at the site of the games, and then the rest in a botched rescue mission. So there's a number of countries that pursue this policy, and what I'm arguing tonight is there's three reasons why this is wrong policy and why I'm speaking thus in favor of this motion. The first point I want to make, and it touches upon the anecdote I just told you, is that the approach is not well thought out, it's not based on considered reflection, it's not based on evidence. As I said, it involved a moment of crisis where the president, speaking off the cuff, put forward this point about no concessions with little evidence, and that kind of created a momentum that has continued to this day. So that's my first point. The second point of my argument is it is a one-size-fits-all policy that doesn't distinguish between terrorist groups, doesn't distinguish between terrorist threats, and thus is even potentially counterproductive at times in that talking to terrorists might actually end violence, whereas not negotiating with them allows that violence to persist or expand for reasons that are inherent in terrorism. So it's not necessarily counterproductive to speak to them. It could potentially actually diffuse violence and end violence. And to put it really kind of bluntly, a policy which treats Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, which I know my opponent is an expert on, the same as the provisional IRA, is a misguided policy. They are not the same. Yes, they are all terrorist groups, but they are not in the same category of terrorism. Some you can negotiate with, and we obviously have examples of that. We have the Good Friday Agreement. Again, most of you are probably too young to remember the level of violence in Northern Ireland prior to the Good Friday Agreement. Yes, some violence has persisted, but it has become a transformed society. For decades, you had something like 3,000 people were killed in Northern Ireland. Effectively, you had a civil war going on in that area. And by talking to terrorists, by putting aside some of the rhetoric, some of that kind of Liam Neeson taken sort of notions, by putting that aside, that led, and obviously there were other aspects as well, but that led to a diminishment of the threat, a decline of violence, and a more peaceful society that would not have been accomplished if not for taking the step to talk to the terrorists. My third point is, even though there is this policy of not talking to terrorists, many governments actually violate their own no negotiations approach. So they talk a good game, they talk tough all the time, but they don't necessarily follow through. So the policy is often performative. And there's numerous examples of this. So for example, certain European and other countries, and I would include my home country, which is not the United States, I might add, but is Canada, that some of these countries, they officially might say, we don't talk to terrorists, we don't pay ransom, but they actually do. They just get a third party to do it. And then they can claim that we didn't violate our principles, we didn't talk to terrorists, we didn't pay ransom. They get someone else to do it. And it's a way of avoiding that kind of connection. But as I said, it is effectively undermining this claim of never talking to terrorists. And there's another example of this, and it's an example I actually remember very well. When I was your age, and this is now we're talking 1986, 1987. I was an undergraduate student, and this is what kind of nerd I was in Canada. I was transfixed watching congressional hearings on American television, because at that point there was a huge scandal in the United States that was known as the Iran-Contra affair. Part of it, the initial scandal, involved a claim that the United States government, the government of Republican Ronald Reagan, the same party of Richard Nixon, that government had traded weapons to the government of Iran, to Tehran, the mortal enemy of the United States, that they're obviously at war as we speak, had traded weapons to Iran for Iran to use its influence over the group Hezbollah that was holding a number of hostages. Americans, British hostages, Terry Waite, an Anglican cleric, was being held. And so when word broke of this, there was a huge outcry in the United States that the US had violated its no concessions policies, that it would never talk to terrorists. Ronald Reagan initially denied that he had spoken, that his government had negotiated with terrorists, and then later in a March 1987 speech admitted that he was mistaken in his initial claim. He assumed responsibility. And so it was there was massive scandal. But again, it pointed to the fact that despite this no concessions policy, they didn't follow through with actually what they said they were going to do. So again, there's tremendous hypocrisy often when it comes to this issue. So I think my opponent will likely contend that one of the reasons we need such a blanket policy is because negotiating with terrorists encourages more terrorism, including the taking of hostages. But where is the uncontested statistical evidence to back that up? British and American citizens found themselves taken hostages before no concessions policies, and they found themselves being taken hostage after the introduction of no concessions policies. And I've got the statistical evidence in terms of the numbers. And this comes from Brian Michael Jenkins, who's a well-known terrorism researcher, scholar. I mean, he knows more about terrorism in his little finger than certainly I would. And he produced numbers looking at, by decade, the number of hostages taken. This is of American citizens. So from 1970 to 1979, again, this is the era when this no concessions policy is introduced, there were 78 kidnappings of US citizens. From 1980 to 1989, there were 66 kidnappings. From 1990 to 1999, not including 1993, where for some reason the database didn't have statistics, there were 118 kidnappings of American citizens. From 2000 to 2009, there were 48 kidnappings. And from 2010 to 2016, this paper came out in 2018, there were 46 kidnappings. So again, it varies, but certainly there's no kind of consistent decline or anything like that, despite the policy of not negotiating, not talking to terrorists. So there's no coherent pattern there, but nor is there evidence, as I said, of a dramatic decline of kidnapped Americans either. Not talking to terrorists also assumes that the main reason for these types of terrorism is because the terrorists want to achieve immediate political goals. And what I say to you is, based on the history of terrorism, there may well be some truth in that, but there are other motivations as well. There are longer term political motivations. And so in some ways, it might be potentially in the interests of terrorists to drag out a hostage taking, to drag out a conflict, because a government is not willing to talk to them, not willing to negotiate them. Terrorism is in some ways armed propaganda. It's a way of getting your message out. It's a way of gaining recruits. All of those things that in some ways governments potentially play into the hands of terrorists when they refuse to negotiate with them, when they refuse to talk to them. And that potentially could lead to people losing their lives with hostages, as we saw happen with Islamic State, where the US, the UK citizens ended up suffering horrendous deaths because of an unwillingness to talk to Islamic State. And I think I will stop there. I don't know.
I thank the speaker for their excellent address. Now we cross the floor and give the call for the opposition speaker to begin the case for opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Mr. President, honorable members, let me start off with an admission. We do negotiate with terrorists. Of course we do, full stop. But this should not be our starting position, and thus it is so important that the narrative exists that we do not negotiate with terrorists. Thus, I deeply regret that this House tonight has the motion in front of it that we regret the narrative that we do not negotiate with terrorists. Now, this is very complex, and it's a triple negative, so if you're confused, fair enough, I'd be confused too. So let me rephrase this a little bit to articulate very clearly the argument I'm going to make tonight. I'll argue in opposition to the motion on the floor, and therefore my argument is the following. I support the narrative that we do not negotiate with terrorists, and if you do so too, and if I'm able to convince you, I urge you to join me in voting down the motion on the floor later tonight. Now, why do we need this narrative that we do not negotiate with terrorists? I'm going to make 3 points. The first point is, it is about preserving the authority and legitimacy of the state. At its core, terrorism is a tactic. Its deployment is a strategic decision of extremists who no longer believe in the peaceful political solutions to their grievances. It's the weapon of the weak. But by engaging in negotiations with such extremists, we prescribe the status of a legitimate political actor on them. In effect, the state would reward individuals or groups that do not play by the rules that we have given us in our constitution on how the political debate and decision-making process works. It would reward blowing stuff up, killing as many people as possible, with a seat at the table and a voice in the decision-making. In effect, it would reward violence while simultaneously weaken democratic processes and obviously undermining the rule of law. And this would send the signal that if you engage in as much as political violence as possible so that the state notices you, a new path to gain political influence becomes available to you, and it's not through the ballot box. That's my first point. The second point I'm going to make is that the narrative matters because it creates deterrence. I know the proposition has its doubts about this, but I'm going to lay out to you why it does create deterrence. Because if governments are seen to negotiate, terrorist groups learn that violence works. And this can be exploited. I want to take you back to 2011. And I think we were all alive in 2011. So there might be some memory here. In 2011, at this point, the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit had been held hostage by Hamas in the Gaza Strip for more than 5 years. Following an agreement between Israel and Hamas in 2011, Israel released 1,027 prisoners in exchange for Shalit. One Israeli soldier for 1,027 prisoners, mostly all Palestinians. As a result, a market price had been established. From now on, Hamas knew the price Israel was willing to pay, not in money, but in Palestinian lives, to return one of its own. And what has followed since, we're all painfully aware of. So even a single concession can create a precedent that will then be exploited further down the line. Or let's look at the kidnapping for ransom or hostage-taking schemes employed by terrorist groups throughout the world. There are various examples. In Iraq, post the 2003 invasion, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and I'll return to Boko Haram in a second, or particularly the affiliates of Al-Qaeda and ISIS on a more global level. Paying ransom to secure the release of your citizens might make for good politics in the short term. And of course, I'd be happy if someone would pay a ransom for me to free me. But in the long term, if you're the state, it's a dangerous policy. Nasser al-Buhaji, the former leader of the Yemen-based Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, called kidnapping, and I quote here, an easy spoil, a profitable trade, and a precious treasure. Umar ud-Khamaha, commander of the Mali-based Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, once said in a newspaper interview, and I quote here again, lots of Western countries are paying enormous sums to the jihadists. The source of our financing is the Western countries. They are paying for jihad. Reports over the years have indicated that hundreds of millions have been paid to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other affiliates to secure the release of hostages. And that money then has been used to finance recruitment efforts, to finance weapons, to finance their terrorist operations. Ransom payments are a major funding source of terrorism. In effect, it has created an industry for human value. It's a business model. Thus, negotiations do not end terrorism. It fuels the next attack. And that's a fact, and I return now to Boko Haram, that Boko Haram is really aware of. Boko Haram has a specialized unit that abducts politicians, business people, foreigners, etc., with the intention of later trading them back for large sums of money for the return of other Boko Haram fighters. So the narrative that we do not negotiate with terrorists thus sends a clear message to terrorist groups. There is nothing to gain from taking hostages because we, the state, we're thinking the long term here. This clear refusal to engage with the hostage-taking economy removes key incentives from the equation. And it removes the price tag and thus diminishes the future value of hostages. In short, and as I said earlier, a state that negotiates under threat teaches its enemies that violence works. But a state that refuses to negotiate teaches them that it does not. This creates the deterrence. And third, and this is my final point, and as a consequence of this, it creates moral clarity. Violence against civilians is unacceptable, period, full stop. But if we negotiate, it normalizes or even excuses such violence. But I admit that the consequence of such a clear position might be the death of a hostage. Fair enough. And there are two examples that come to mind in that context. The first, on September 5th, 1977, Hans-Martin Schleyer, a leading German business executive at the time, was kidnapped by the far-left terrorist organization Red Army Faction. 1977 was a watershed for Germany. In spring, the Red Army Faction had assassinated the federal prosecutor general, followed by the assassination of the CEO of the Dresdner Bank in summer. Then in September, Schleyer was kidnapped. The West German government did not negotiate. To further increase the pressure on the government, terrorists from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which were allied with the Red Army faction at the time, hijacked Lufthansa Flight 181, also known as the Landshut. And that happened on October 13, 1977. The West German government did not budge. Instead, in the early hours of October 18, the next day, German special forces stormed the Landshut while parked on the tarmac at Mogadishu International Airport. All hostages were freed. Shortly afterwards, the imprisoned leaders of the Red Army faction committed suicide in German prisons. A day later, the body of Hans-Martin Schleyer was found. He was killed. Half a year later, in Italy this time, another far-left terrorist kidnapping took place. On the morning of March 16, 1978, the former Italian Prime Minister, Aldo Moro, was kidnapped by terrorists of the far-left terrorist organization Red Brigades. Similar to Germany, Italy refused to negotiate. 54 days later, Moore's body was found. He was killed by terrorists. In both cases, the respective government did not negotiate. No ransom was paid, no political concessions were made, and the hostages died, killed by terrorists. But giving in would have elevated their status and power in society without them having to follow through on what they said they were committed to do: to kill for the purpose of achieving their own set goals. Since the governments did not give in, the terrorist groups conducted the act of killing. But by taking their life, these terrorist groups severely damaged their narrative and subsequently lost their power over society and eventually dramatically lost support. It was their peak, and from then on they declined. It was an own goal. This shows the importance of having moral clarity, no matter how hard it might be, and it is hard. Yes, refusing to negotiate might sacrifice innocent lives that could be saved. But the emphasis here is on could, because there is no guarantee that terrorists might actually hold up their end of the bargain. And yet, it is an emotionally compelling argument to negotiate, but it's fundamentally, strategically short-sighted. If terrorists know hostage-taking works, they will repeat it on a large scale, and that returns us to Hamas and October 7th. Thus, it endangers much more people in the long run. A policy that saves one group of hostages by encouraging 10 more kidnappings or 20 more kidnappings, you name it, is not humane, it's grossly negligent. Instead, governments have a duty to protect the population as a whole. They must act for collective security and not just for the immediate outcomes, not for what might be politically expedient in that particular moment. If you will, this is tragic, but it's a necessary trade-off to minimize total harm. The cases of Germany and Italy have shown its effectiveness. And the case of Israel, what can happen if a dangerous precedent has been set. So let me close with this, and that's my final point. Yes, negotiating with terrorists may save lives today. I admit that. I've been open about this from the beginning. But it incentivizes tomorrow's violence. A firm refusal is not indifference, it's a long-term commitment to reducing harm, protecting legitimacy, and denying terrorism the power it seeks. That's why the narrative matters. And that's why I urge you all to join me in voting nay on the motion on the floor tonight. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back.
I thank the Speaker for that excellent address. And it is now time to open up the debate to the floor, which means the audience. So anybody in attendance can have the opportunity to give a speech. Because this is a 1v1 debate, we have quite a lot of time for floor speeches, but so that we can get through everybody, if you could please keep it to 2 or 3 minutes, then I will gather you if you go over that. At the start of your speech, please say your name nice and clearly. We have minute books that go back about 200 years, and if you state your name nice and clearly at the start of your speech, then we can include that along with your contributions to the debate this evening to be added to our history. The final thing to say is the best floor speech to be decided between ourselves will receive this enormous trophy for you to put up, pride of place on your mantelpiece at home if you win that. So, do we have any speeches from the floor? Yes.
All right. Hi, Jamie. You know my name already. The opposition claims that terrorists disregard international law by breaking the rules by blowing things up. Is this not what we do in other parts of the world? Do we not terrorize Gazans when we aid and abet their slaughter? Do we not place a price on Iranian heads, not in lives but in mere dollars? Were we not terrorists when we shelled a school filled with little girls earlier this month? The opposition claims that violence against citizens shouldn't be allowed, but why isn't this grace given when these citizens are brown? What are the morals that you claim that the West maintains clarity with? The question that I pose for both benches is a definition as to who are the terrorists and why is this the case. Why is it when imperialists commit the same action from the imperialized that it's seen as preemptive strikes and defensive action? It's unclear as how you're able to make your case, how this debate is able to move forward, without a characterization of who these terrorists are and a defense of this characterization. I leave you with the definition of terrorism. It is calculated use of threat or violence to induce fear, intending to coerce governments or societies, often to achieve political, religious, or ideological goals. It's just not what Western liberal democracies do in other parts of the world. I leave you with that.
Do we have any further speeches from the floor? In the back, the tab.
I want to start by directly responding to that, and I want to say that I think that many people do have a good idea of what terrorism is. There are many different types of groups, Hezbollah, ISIS, who do significantly worse things than what Western countries do in their own countries. And I'm just going to state that flat out. I think that if you have, I guess, time and effort to put into, I guess, looking at some of the testimonies of people who have escaped the oppressive governments that have taken hold in some of those places, especially from women and children, it is valuable. I think that I'm going to agree with the opposition here that starting to bargain with terrorists gives them a pretty large debating chip on the playground. And if they can actually take a look at how this has formed countries' policies, not only in the grassroots governments that take control of them over time. We do have countries that have started out as something along the lines of democracies after World War II. Because World War II drastically reshaped the way that a lot of the governments worked. But after World War II, you had some of these groups rise, especially things based around religion. Religious terrorism was a huge part of it that took over the governments because people were willing to negotiate with them throughout the entirety of the idea of diplomacy, right? Because if I could save a few lives now, it might help my ship later. And I'd say that this is not only a thing in East versus West, even in the West. A country like Mexico frequently negotiates with the cartel. And if you're paying attention at all to what's happening in Mexico, that has not gone very well. There was the slaughter of thousands of people after a cartel leader was killed because people were trying to negotiate and people have negotiated with them for a long time. So that's why I agree with the opposition here.
Do we have any further speeches from the floor? Yes. Rock, paper, scissors.
So the opposition seems to define terrorism as an opposition to the power of the state. So if there is, say, a hostage taking, that gives the state two options if we're not negotiating with terrorists. They either do nothing, which I believe would delegitimize the state, because you're saying that the terrorists, in effect, can do what they want and do as they please. But if the response to the terrorists is more harsh, or perceived as more harsh, than the terrorists themselves, would that not just incentivize more grievance in the communities which those terrorists came from? I think there is a place for negotiations. There's a place for other methods of resolving a situation. You can't define terrorism as one thing, as we've heard tonight. Terrorist groups have different goals depending on what they are. It's a very broad term. Boko Haram has different goals and different methods to, say, the IRA or Hezbollah. These are not comparable groups. They're not comparable in their goals, and they're not comparable in their methods. And so I don't think a single policy can be taken on every single situation. Thank you.
Any further speeches from the floor? Yes.
Is Aoife 3 minutes? I want to take issue with the opposition's proposal that terrorism is a weapon of the weak, whereas in many cases it's a weapon. In many cases, it's a weapon of the weakened, and that it is a violent response to the structural violence of the state. Whenever you don't have the legitimate or the political means to express your discontent with the state, there is no option. Whenever the British Army opened fire on a peaceful protest for human rights in Derry in 1969, what are you meant to do other than take up arms and challenge that violence? Whenever the consociational government in Lebanon is formed by the elite cartel, as it's been called, of both the Maronites and the Sunnis, and there's no representation for the Shia. What are you meant to do but take up arms whenever you don't have the legitimate means to challenge the government? So I think calling out it is a means of violently, but still bringing yourself a seat to the table that you have been structurally denied. And it brings you to the table to negotiate in a peaceful means eventually. But, yeah, that's my thank you.
At the back, the song behind you, sorry.
I want to, my name is Maya. I want to point out that this debate depends a lot on how we find terrorists and who is included in the we and not to negotiate with terrorists. Does this mean state government? Does this mean just Western governments? Or does it mean just the people in this room who maybe not be in a position to make that decision whether they want to negotiate with terrorists? But if we assume that it's just state governments, this has implications for states who also terrorism and questioning, to what extent is state actions considered acts of terrorism. I think to probably debate this topic, we need to first define what we're actually debating. Thank you.
Alright, my name is Rachel Levy for the minutes. A few things I want to point out. First of all, most commonly terrorists, even if they have a sole political motive that they're trying to achieve, generally they don't want peace unless it's under their specific terms. And so I would say I agree with the opposition that you can't negotiate with someone that is not going to come to a conclusion without having something in a big favor for them. So let's go back to the 2011 hostage exchange deal. In one of the Israeli prisoners, or the Palestinian prisoners that was sent back over was Yahya Sinwar, who was the leader of Hamas who orchestrated the October 7th attacks. That caused mass casualties everywhere. That was not a peaceful thing. There was nothing peaceful about it. And I would say if we negotiate with terrorists, it automatically enables much more catastrophe later on. And some of those people that we send back, as we've seen in that situation, cause much more stuff. And even if there are some groups that have political motives that might be good, if we automatically attribute it to violence, nothing is going to get done. And then at that point, you become extreme enough in your views that you're willing to settle for anything. And so I would agree with the opposition that you can't negotiate with people that don't want peace and terrorists generally. So, yeah.
My name is George. I want to ask the opposition a relatively specific question, which is even if we grant that sometimes negotiating with terrorists is efficacious, not just in the short term, but in the long term, I think the opposite definitely isn't true. It's not always efficacious. Sometimes negotiating with terrorists causes bad outcomes. And so I wanted to ask, is it possible that even if we grant that the waters are muddy, that the narrative has done more good than harm by reducing our state's culpability in atrocities? If we did not negotiate at some point where it would have caused harm, I mean, what is the Blackstone's ratio for negotiating with terrorists? Maybe that's all I want to say.
I'm Sula, and I also had quite a specific point. I wanted to contest the opposition's point that not negotiating with terrorists creates even more violence. And I'd say, as we stated before, that terrorism is the refuge of the desperate rather than the weak. And if you put someone in a situation where they do not have any representation by the government that is presiding over them, and they resort to terrorism, and you do not negotiate with them, in that way you only invite further violence and further terrorism. So negotiating with terrorists in an instance of imminent bodily danger to a number of people is perhaps not productive for that mechanism, but for the wider society that created the discontent, perhaps it could prevent further violence.
to the minutes. Something that I just think is interesting is that this is a debate about narrative, but we've only talked about how this narrative affects terrorists. Everybody in this room has heard this narrative. Does it make you feel proud that your nation doesn't negotiate? Is it when you hear, though, that 200 people got captured and your nation doesn't negotiate? How does that make you feel about them? How do the people feel when they hear that their nation negotiated and got 50 people released, and they were one of them, but the other 150 didn't? I think this thing is that both sides of the House have agreed that the countries will negotiate and countries will not negotiate, depending on specific circumstances. But how does this narrative really affect the people who are living in it, the people who are hearing about this on the news? This is something I just think I would like to hear about more from both sides, because it's something that I think is really important, especially when looking at the motion. Thank you.
Yes, at the back. Yeah.
Hi, my name is David Cairns for the minutes. I'd like to first of all contest the statistical point that the proposition made. So you made the argument that not negotiating with terrorists has not caused a decrease in the taking of hostages. But would you be able to provide evidence that negotiating with terrorists does not cause an increase in the taking of hostages? And I think a good example of how, and I think it would cause an increase in the taking of hostages. I think I agree with the opposition that negotiating with terrorists increases future terrorism. And a good example of this is, of course, the example that the opposition gave of Hamas. They took an Israeli hostage in 2011, Israel negotiated, and then since then what we've had is a lot worse terrorism. And I'd also like to just make a quick point about some of the previous points I've been making from before about how terrorism is it's not a weapon of the weak, it's a weapon of the weekend, it's a weapon of the desperate. This almost sounds like you're trying to justify terrorists. You gave the example of Lebanon, it sounds like you're trying to justify Hezbollah. This is rather scary. Thank you.
Right, well, it's one of my last debates, so I have to bring it back to my degree. I have a question for both, I know, I'm so sorry, for proposition and opposition in different ways. How does either negotiating or not negotiating with terrorists work when we have religious fundamentalists that simply do not have a value on their own lives, the lives of the cause, and are somewhat separating themselves from traditional political terrorism as we see it? When you're dealing with radicalism that is very much involved with a larger eschatological idea, how is either of your approaches appropriate considering this is the terrorism we see most, I guess, violent at the moment? Thank you.
Yes, well, Phoebe and then Alex.
Hi, Phoebe for the minutes. Just to build on something Ryan said, I was wondering if you could, especially opposition, talk a bit more about how like in the example of hostages, for example, on a purely pragmatic way, why this narrative exists and what role you think society and particular media, who say just have this message that they just want their hostages back, plays in this motion. I think it's very fair for you to say that when you step back and see that the states are essentially funding terrorist organisations, it's shocking. But how realistic is it for these states strategically to not negotiate with terrorists when they do seek, especially in like Western democratic countries, to appeal to masses, and a lot of media and stuff pulls on the sympathetic strings of the masses of like, we just want our people back. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, as both sides says, we do negotiate with terrorists. Yay, we're hypocrites. Okay. But in what circumstances do we negotiate with terrorists? Usually in like the big cases that come to mind, as Prop mentioned, the Good Friday Agreement, cases with Palestinian and other Arab organizations. They are cases that generally escape the very strict confines of terrorism. They are cases that we see broader political issues, and we see broader segments of society, if you think Northern Ireland, that are involved in a conflict or whatever the issue is. The narrative exists there. It's there, and it's very, very important, because for most of history, and especially in Europe and the Western world, because let's be honest, this is a motion that concerns the liberal democracies of the West. If you're an authoritarian regime somewhere else, you don't negotiate with anyone anyways. Well, not generally, but especially with terrorists. Is because most of these countries have had to deal with domestic terrorism. As Ob mentioned, Baader-Meinhof in Germany, Brigade Rossa, November 17th in Greece. And the baseline is that these organizations do not have credible demands. I'm sorry, Brigade Rossa did not have credible demands to bring up a communist revolution in democratic Italy. Same applies for November 17th in Greece. And so it's that you don't have credible demands, and you're not bringing them about in the context of a liberal democracy in a democratic way. So the narrative is there because it states that we as a society stand against those methods and practices. Now, of course, we break this narrative. We break many narratives. A level of hypocrisy is not only natural, it's good for politics, and it's the only way for democratic politics, I'm going to say, to function. So the narrative has done very well to exist and should do very, very well to continue. Thank you very much.
I've been here for 2 years. I've never risen a POI, but thank you basically for being here. It's a great speech from both of you. I have one question for both sides. For the opposition, I'd like to question how this narrative affects greater state behavior. So when we looked at the post-9/11 invasions, there was a narrative from US government that we don't negotiate with terrorists, and therefore negotiating with these states isn't something we can do, and we can push a full-scale invasion. I was wondering if you could comment on this. For the proposition, I have a quite different question, which is basically what this narrative looks like, and if we could be a bit more clear for the whole room, because it sounds like in some POIs, or in floor speeches, sorry, there was a bit of discrepancy in what we think this looks like, and then to unlock the benefits that you seek to find in your speech, why this narrative is so powerful that it is able to change the behavior of like state leaders and negotiators with terrorists in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for your contributions this evening. It is now time to return the debate to the dispatch boxes, and so I would like to invite the opposition speaker to conclude the case for opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Okay, so there was obviously, unsurprisingly, a lot of speaking contributions directed at the opposition. So I'll try to get to as many of you as possible, but please forgive me if I simply couldn't catch all of them. I want to start with kind of one issue that has come up is the question of international law and the apparently Western perception of terrorism. So I made it very clear in my speech that this is a universal policy. I never made a distinction between a Western state, a non-Western state. So I'm arguing that this should be a universal policy that we need, or the policy that we do not negotiate with terrorists means we need to have this narrative universally applied that we do not negotiate with terrorists. So that's my first point. The second point I want to make is, because that has also come up, and it's probably something you might want to touch on as well, it's the definition of terrorism. Now, I don't know how much you know about terrorism, but there is no universally agreed definition on terrorism. It has a couple of reasons. One reason is, and that also goes back to the history, that at some point, and some of you alluded to this, it's really hard to agree on what terrorism actually is. Because some states will say, well, that's a terrorist group because, it's a threat to the state. Whereas other people would say, oh, those are freedom fighters. They're fighting for, freedom. They're fighting against oppression. Because you mentioned the Northern Ireland example, where surely, if you're getting gunned down by the British Army, you want to resist, right? We all understand that. But because there is this issue that to some extent perspective matters, and the perspectives you're taking, that makes it really hard to agree on on a definition of terrorism. So unfortunately, I cannot provide you a definition of terrorism, even though there were one or two were read out. but you will find, I think there's a book that has 250 different definitions of terrorism in it. Have a look at it, it's fascinating, but even that book can't agree on one certain definition of terrorism. Then another really good point is, and that returns me to the Northern Ireland example, is that there is this, there's the idea that if you rely on terrorism, there's nothing else you could do. Like, it's like your last resort. And someone pointed out Lebanon, and I want to say Hezbollah. If you're a member of Hezbollah, that's a terrorist organization, there's no doubt about it. But Hezbollah is part of the political system in Lebanon. It's part of the government. So there is no excuse to say, well, you know, we need to resort to terrorism because that's the only, kind of like the only weapon we have left. You're part of the political process. That you have an issue with Israel and you want to advocate for the destruction of Israel, well, that's your policy, that's on you. But if you want to make your voices heard, you already do so. You're part of the government. I think at this point, the Minister of Health is a member of Hezbollah. So that argument doesn't really work here. And then there was the question of like how we should respond to terrorism, whether it's like a military response, similar to post 9/11, where there was an invasion in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this is obviously something which is really hard to defend, and I'm not making this case that I'm defending a military response to that, because it always matters on the context. But, and you probably remember this better than I do, because I was a baby, but there was a lot when the Iraq invasion happened. I think it was the Iraq or the Afghanistan invasion. Actually, lots of international relations scholars published an op-ed saying it's ridiculous to invade a foreign country in response to a terrorist attack. Because some of you might be IR scholars, and if you're a realist, the question is like, how has this affected the international system? Is like the existence of the United States at risk? No, it's not. You can take the hit, so to say. So there is the issue of like how we should respond to terrorism. And in my contribution, I purely focus on the question whether we should negotiate or not. It's not about whether we should use military force or not. It's purely about negotiating. And then to a couple of points, I want to rebuttal what the proposition said, because one point I think that was made is that, and I said this as well, we negotiate with terrorists, right? So it's kind of like hypocritical to say we should not negotiate with terrorists if there's evidence that we do negotiate with terrorists. But I think, and I would argue, that is exactly why the narrative matters. Because it sets a clear public standard and deterrent, as I argued, because it reduces the expectations of terrorists to succeed. They know we're not negotiating, even though sometimes we do, but the starting position is always we should not negotiate, period. And simply because something is imperfectly enforced, that's not a reason to abandon this general narrative or rule that we should not negotiate with terrorists. It's actually a reason that we should think about ways we can strengthen that. And then I want to close with the following point. In a way, there was a lot of like contributions also by the proposition that we should focus on like the immediate wake of a terrorist attack, like the emotional toll it takes on you who follows the news and sees it, on the people who are like who are like experiencing it firsthand. But, and that returns me to my point, terrorism is a strategy. It's not a singular event. If we reward a strategy with negotiations, we just simply are faced with repetition. It will come back and back and back. But if we refuse to negotiate, that it's not about being indifferent to like to what happens to the people. It's about attempting to break the cycle of constant repetition, repetition, repetition. And so that's why the narrative that we do not negotiate with terrorism matters, because it gives us this strategic consistency, and that is crucial when it comes to counterterrorism, because having ambiguity is exploitable, and that's what terrorists want. And that's why I urge you to vote nay on the motion. Thank you.
Speaker for their excellent address. And now we cross the floor and give the call to the proposition bench to conclude the debate this evening. Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you all for amazing contributions. I had trouble keeping track of all of them. I'll try to address some, I think, in my broader points as I do, and I want to thank the opposition as well. I think you had the tougher case to make, and I got to pick first, so I appreciate that as well. So I want to just reiterate, and I'm not arguing actually that negotiation should be the first response to terrorism. I'm not making that case at all. And all I'm saying in support of the motion is that a blanket policy of no negotiation is a one-size-fits-all. It does not recognize differences. Someone made the point about religiously motivated terrorists versus those with more defined political goals. And so therefore it is counterproductive. I'm not even saying, as I said, that it should be the main response. I'm certainly not a pacifist. I'm saying it should be in the toolbox, and you shouldn't rule it out right away. So in making this case, a no negotiations policy, which often, by the way, is driven by domestic politics as well. I mean, let's face it, this is also about politics. We know during the time of Tony Blair, I mean, this came out in the diaries of some Labour MPs, that some of the new counter-terrorism laws that they brought in, Blair actually said to the Labour caucus, this is a way of wrong-footing the opposition. So let's face it, some of this taking a tough stance is about politics. To take you back to the 1970s, early 1970s, Nixon's Secretary of State, William Rogers, regularly said that we need, and I'm quoting here, we need a masculine policy to respond to terrorists. And every time he said that, he pounded his fist into his hand. So this was a kind of macho, this is where governments feel like they've lost the narrative, that they're weakened in the face of terrorists. So yeah, so my argument is obviously not that, that negotiation should even be the first approach. So how do, by the way, someone asked about statistics, I'm going to respond not about hostages, but about terrorism itself. How do terrorist groups end? To quote again, the RAND Corporation. There was a study that came out in the early 2000s. This is in the aftermath of the Bush administration deciding to militarize the response to 9/11. They looked at 648 terrorist groups from 1968 to the early 2000s to 2006. How did those groups, how did they end? And you know what the main way these groups ended? By joining the political process. And in some cases that included peace agreements, which obviously involved negotiations. Second on the list was disruption by police and intelligence agencies. Some of the groups won. FLN, Liberation Group, used terrorist methods, one in Algeria. Military was at the bottom in terms of ending terrorist groups. So I'm saying statistically, looking at a historical sample of terrorist groups, that negotiations are actually a tool, or it can be useful, as we saw in Northern Ireland, when it comes to bringing about the end of terrorism, the end of violence, and saving lives. So just to end off, again, in support of the motion, hard choices are often required to end violence. No responses to the scourge of terrorism, including negotiating with terrorists, should be left off the table. To do otherwise is to unnecessarily put lives at risk for no useful reason beyond a performative political desire to be viewed as acting tough. We don't need more Liam Neesons and Taken in terms of responding to terrorism. We need subtlety, we need intelligence. And I'll end there. Thank you, in support of the motion.
Thank you to our speakers and indeed all members of the House for what was a fine debate this evening. It is now time to call the House to a vote. So, if you side with the proposition and you do regret the narrative that we do not negotiate with terrorists, please raise your hand nice and high.
Okay.
Wow.
Anyways.
And all those who side with the opposition. And any abstentions?
Liberals.
Perfect. We will surely have announcements from board, but before we get to that, I will do the normal public debates announcement, which is to say that next week we do not have a debate, but we do have our AGM. We are starting a little bit earlier than usual because there is a lot of stuff to get through, but if you would like to directly involve yourself in the democratic process of this society, to learn a little bit more about what we do, there will be reports and speeches before we vote in the various positions, then please do come along to that. And the other thing to announce is that we are collecting motions, we are collecting the topics for debate for next year. So if there is anything you would like to see debated, you would like to see us get in expert speakers like we do every week, please do suggest some motions. We are entirely reliant on your suggestions to put this together, and we will be putting together next year's program in about a month or so. So feel free to suggest as many things as you want, all different topics, on that form, which I think can also be found on our Instagram as well, if you don't get it this evening. Do we have any other announcements from board? Yes.
Well, if you enjoyed that, which I definitely did, and you want to keep talking about it, we have our weekly social at Main Bar in the Union. This is open to both students and speakers, so please come around for a drink and a further conversation. It would be great to see you all there. And besides that, that's all from me.
Do you have any further announcements from board?
So photos-wise and video-wise, please let me know if you don't want your face in anything. Just come up to me.
Can I just stress, for the AGM, it is a 7:15, like, we close the door at this point. We cannot let you in by the union rules. If you were late past this, I'm sorry. But, like, I know a lot of people show up close to 8 for these debates. We can't let you in. Yeah.
I got locked out of the first one I tried to go to. Yeah, Matilda.
And for the AGM, you have to bring your matriculation card. That's absolutely essential if you want to come and vote in the AGM. You have to bring your matriculation card.
All of this info is on our Instagram.
Fantastic. I think then it is time to announce the results of the debate this evening. Before we get to the results, the floor speech prize this week goes to Rachel. Please come and get the trophy in a second if you'd like that. And then the results of the debate: for the proposition, 13, for the opposition, 35, with 14 abstentions. Therefore, the nays have it, the nays have it.